John sat in the cold, sterile silence of his mansion, surrounded by the wealth he had spent his life acquiring, but feeling emptier than ever. He had everything money could buy, but nothing that truly mattered. That was until he saw them. 7 little girls at an orphanage, eyes full of hope, each longing for a chance at a better life. In them, John saw the family he had always yearned for but never had. He made a decision that would change everything. He would adopt them. But little did he know, decades later, these same girls would return, bringing something that would leave him in tears, a gift that no amount of wealth could ever replace. But before we dive deeper into the story, let me know where you're watching this from in the comments below. And if you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next chapter. John sat at the corner of the grand dining table in his mansion, the massive chandelier above casting a dim glow on the polished marble floors. The air was thick with silence, broken only by the occasional tick of a grandfather clock in the hallway. The house, with its towering walls and priceless antiques, stood as a fortress of wealth and isolation. Nothing moved, nothing breathed. It was a place that looked alive from the outside, but inside, it was hollow, just like the man who owned it. At 65, John had everything money could buy, a vast fortune that stretched far beyond his imagination when he was younger, and a mansion filled with the kind of luxury most could only dream of. But as he sat in that empty room, staring at the gleaming crystal goblet in front of him, the feeling of emptiness gnawed at him. The wealth, the accolades, the possessions, none of it filled the void. There was no warmth in his life, no laughter, no companionship, just the cold echo of his own thoughts bouncing off the cold, empty walls. John had once been that young boy, shivering and starving in the orphanage, clutching onto the hope that someone would come for him. He had waited for years for a family, but that day never came. The loneliness of those years never truly left him, even as he built his empire. He had convinced himself that success could replace the love he craved as a child. But as he sat in his opulent home, he realized how wrong he had been. That night, at the charity event, everything changed. It was an ordinary evening, at least that's what he had thought when he arrived at the event, a room full of people in expensive suits and dresses, exchanging pleasantries, pretending to care about the cause they were donating to. It was another event to network, another chance to flaunt his wealth. But then, as he stood by the bar, his eyes landed on a father and his daughter, laughing together as they shared a joke. The girl, no older than 6, giggled so brightly, so freely, that it seemed to fill the room with light. The father, holding her hand gently, spoke to her with such tenderness, such care, that John felt something stir deep inside him, a knot forming in his chest. For the first time in years, John felt a profound ache, a sorrow that caught him off guard. It was like being punched in the gut by something he had long buried. He looked away quickly, trying to regain control, but the image of the father and daughter lingered in his mind. They reminded him of what he had never had, a family, a bond, love. For all the years he had spent acquiring everything he could ever want, he had never learned how to truly live, how to love, how to give. The laughter from the pair echoed in his ears as he walked through the crowd, avoiding eye contact with anyone who might stop him. He could hear the conversations around him, but none of it mattered. He was lost in his own thoughts, a prisoner of his own mind. The emptiness he had always felt seemed to stretch further, consuming him. He was alone. Despite the wealth, despite the power, he was still that abandoned child, surrounded by things that didn't matter. The ache in his chest was unbearable. As the night wore on, John couldn't shake the feeling. He excused himself from the party early, muttering something about business, but the truth was, he couldn't bear to stay. He needed to be alone. He needed to think. Back at the mansion, in the silence of his study, John sat in the dim light of his desk lamp, his mind racing. What was it that he truly wanted? It wasn't more money, more luxury, or more power. What was it that could fill the emptiness inside him? He had everything he had ever dreamed of, but it was never enough. He thought of the orphanage where he had spent his childhood, the dark, cold halls, the loneliness that had suffocated him. He had hated it, hated the feeling of being invisible, unwanted. And now, in the quiet of his grand home, he realized that he still felt like that boy, still invisible, still unwanted. Only now he had the means to change that, to have a family, to provide a child with the love he never had. John's eyes flickered to the framed photograph on his desk, a picture of 6 girls smiling at the camera. They were his employees' daughters, orphans he had met at a charity event a few weeks back. Something about their stories, their resilience, their hopeful eyes, tugged at something deep within him. These girls, in a way, reminded him of his younger self, lost and alone, waiting for someone to care. Without another thought, he reached for his phone and dialed the number of his lawyer. "Make the arrangements," he said, his voice steady but firm. "I'm adopting them." In that moment, John knew what he had to do. He could no longer live in this mansion of emptiness. It was time to fill it with life, with love, with the kind of family he had always dreamed of. John couldn't sleep that night. The decision he had made lingered in his mind, gnawing at him with a relentless intensity. 6 girls. His heart told him it was the right thing to do, but his mind questioned everything. Could he truly be the father they needed? Could he really offer them what they deserved after all these years of emotional neglect? He had no experience raising children. He had lived his whole life building an empire, not a family. The weight of this new responsibility pressed heavily on him. But then, in the darkness of his room, he remembered their faces. The 6 girls from the orphanage. Each one so different, yet bound by the same haunting uncertainty. Angela, the eldest, with her quiet strength and cautious eyes. Maya, the youngest, a fragile smile always on her lips, hiding her fear behind it. He remembered the way their faces looked when they spoke of their hopes and dreams. They hadn't asked for much. They just wanted someone to see them, someone to offer them a chance, and in their eyes, John saw what he had longed for all his life, the possibility of family. The next morning, after a restless night, he made the call. His lawyer had already started the paperwork, but this was different now. John had spent decades avoiding connections, avoiding the messiness of real relationships, but now there was no turning back. He had made up his mind. He would offer them a chance he never had. The drive to the orphanage was long, the road winding through the city before finally opening up to the quieter, more desolate part of town. John had been there once before, but this time was different. As the mansion loomed behind him, he wondered if he was making a mistake, if he was simply acting out of some misplaced guilt, or worse, pity. But as the orphanage came into view, something inside him pushed those thoughts aside. This was no longer about guilt or pity. This was about giving them a chance, a better life, a better future. He walked into the orphanage with purpose, his footsteps heavy, each one echoing in the otherwise quiet space. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and dust, the same musty smell he remembered from his childhood. The children had all gathered in the main room, a tired and worn space with faded walls and mismatched furniture. They paused as he entered, a mix of curiosity and apprehension in their eyes. John tried to smile, but it felt unnatural, almost forced. "Hello?" he said, his voice low, steady. "I'm John." Angela, the oldest of the girls, stepped forward. Her eyes locked with his, and for a moment they stood there, sizing each other up. He could feel the weight of her gaze, the skepticism in her eyes. She was clearly the protector of the group, the one who kept everyone together, kept them safe from the world. She had learned the hard way that adults didn't always follow through on their promises. "I know this is unexpected," John continued, his voice cracking slightly. "But I'm here because I believe I can offer you all something better, something you deserve." Maya, the youngest, stood behind Angela, peeking out from behind her. Her big brown eyes were wide with confusion, and her little fingers clutched the hem of Angela's shirt. John felt a lump form in his throat. This little girl, with her innocent expression, was so much like the child he used to be. He could almost see himself in her, scared, unsure, but yearning for a future filled with love and hope. One of the other girls, a few years older than Maya, stepped forward, her eyes wary. "What do you want from us?" she asked, her voice small but sharp. She didn't trust him, and why should she? John had spent his whole life building wealth, isolating himself from everything that truly mattered. Now he was standing here, offering them something he wasn't sure he could give. What if they didn't want his help? What if they saw through him, saw the emptiness inside him? "I don't want anything from you," John said, his voice softening. "I want to give you something, a chance, a home. I want you to have the life you deserve. I know I'm not perfect, and I don't know how to do this, but I'm willing to try. For you..." The room was silent for a long moment, as if the words themselves hung in the air, uncertain. Finally, Angela nodded, the faintest flicker of something resembling trust in her eyes. It wasn't much, but it was enough for John to feel a spark of hope. He left the orphanage that day with a weight in his chest. He had seen their faces, heard their doubts, and now he couldn't turn back. His lawyer had already begun processing the adoption papers, but John still found himself hesitating, uncertain. His friends had questioned his decision. They had asked him if he was really ready for this kind of responsibility. The world he had built was one of power and control, not love and care. Could he really shift from one to the other? But deep down, John knew the answer. He had to. For them. For himself. Days passed in a blur of paperwork and phone calls. The adoption process wasn't easy. There were questions, delays, and the constant reminder that John wasn't exactly the ideal candidate for parenthood. His life had been about solitude, about making money, about building his legacy, but now he was doing something that scared him to his core. And that fear, it was exactly what made him know he was doing the right thing. The day the girls moved into his mansion was one of the most surreal of John's life. The mansion that had always been cold and impersonal now felt like a cage, too large, too intimidating for children who had grown up in a world of uncertainty. The moment they arrived, it was clear that they felt the same. The house felt alien to them. They stayed together in one room, a single small space at the far end of the hall. They huddled together, unsure if they could truly call this place home. John watched them from the doorway, the girls sitting quietly on the large bed, their eyes wide as they took in the space. The room was filled with extravagant furniture, expensive plush rugs, a giant 4-poster bed, a grand piano in the corner, but none of it seemed to matter. The mansion, for all its wealth and beauty, felt empty, just like the orphanage. It wasn't home yet, not for them, not for him. John walked into the room trying to hide the uncertainty he felt. "You can choose any room you want," he said softly. "This house is yours now, too." But the words felt hollow, falling flat against the walls. He had spent his life creating a world of luxury, but none of it mattered. What good was it if there was no love to fill it, no laughter to echo through the halls? Angela glanced up at him, her eyes soft but guarded. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. John nodded, but he could see the doubt in her eyes. She didn't trust him yet, and who could blame her? He was a stranger to them, an outsider. But he would prove himself. He had to. He turned and left the room, his footsteps heavy as he walked down the long hallway. This mansion, with all its riches, was still as empty as the orphanage had been. But he wouldn't give up. Not now. Not when there was so much to give. He had made his decision, and there was no turning back. He would make this place a home, not just for them, but for himself as well. And maybe, just maybe, they would find what they were looking for in the mansion's cold, empty halls. John had never experienced anything like this before. The house, the space that had once felt so cold, now had a strange warmth to it. He had worked so hard to build a world of wealth and comfort, but the truth was, it had never felt like home. It wasn't until the girls came into his life that something truly began to change. He had been afraid of failing them, afraid of becoming the father figure they needed when he himself had never known what it felt like to be truly loved. But now, standing in the foyer, his heart racing in his chest, John realized something had shifted. He wasn't just their guardian anymore. They were becoming his family. The front door opened, and as John stepped into the house, he was hit with the soft glow of lights twinkling in the living room. The air smelled of freshly baked cake, a sharp contrast to the usual sterile atmosphere that filled the house. The living room was transformed, filled with balloons and streamers hanging from the high ceilings. The girls had done it all themselves, carefully arranged the decorations, put up the lights, and set a table in the center with a cake placed in the middle. The cake, simple yet heartfelt, read, "Thank you, Dad." If you find this content interesting, please give me a like so I know and have more motivation to make better quality videos. Like if you find this video useful, it helped me a lot. John froze at the sight, his eyes widening as the realization hit him like a punch to the gut. His chest tightened, and, for the first time in months, the mask he'd carefully constructed over his emotions cracked. He had wanted this. No, needed this. But he had never expected it to happen so quickly, so naturally. He was not prepared for the overwhelming flood of emotion that surged through him. Angela, standing beside the cake, looked up at him with a mixture of pride and vulnerability in her eyes. The girls had all gathered around, watching him expectantly, their faces bright with excitement. Maya, the youngest, grinned up at him, her eyes sparkling with innocence and joy. "Surprise," Angela said, her voice soft, almost shy. John swallowed hard, his throat tight as he tried to find his words. I don't know what to say," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The lump in his throat made it hard to breathe. "It's okay, Dad," Maya said, her small hand reaching for his. "You're our family now." The room was silent for a heartbeat. John blinked, his mind struggling to comprehend the weight of the words she had just spoken. He had spent his entire life avoiding connections, isolating himself from real human bonds, thinking he could fill the emptiness with success and wealth. But now, in this moment, surrounded by the 6 girls who had slowly come to trust him, he understood something profound. His wealth meant nothing compared to the love and acceptance they were offering him. He took a step forward, feeling his body shake with emotion. It was impossible to hold back the tears that stung the corners of his eyes. He cleared his throat, trying to maintain some semblance of composure. You girls don't know how much this means to me," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I've spent my whole life building things, but none of that means anything without you. I'm the one who should be thanking you." Angela smiled softly, her face full of the quiet strength she had always carried. She had been the most cautious, the most reserved. But tonight, she was different. Tonight, she was giving him the acceptance he had longed for. "Don't thank us, Dad. We're just happy to have you," she said, her voice steady. John finally allowed the tears to fall. He hadn't let himself cry in years, not since he was a child, left alone in that cold orphanage. But now, with his daughters standing around him giving him something he never thought he deserved, he realized that it was okay to feel vulnerable. It was okay to need them. And more importantly, it was okay to love them. He looked at the cake again, then back at them. I guess I don't need to say much more," he said, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "Except, thank you." They all gathered around him, and in that moment, John knew with absolute certainty that he had found what he was always searching for: family. The house, the mansion that had been so silent and hollow, now echoed with life, with love. It wasn't just a place anymore, it was home. The days following the party were a blur of laughter, meals, and bonding. John had no idea how to cook, but he wasn't about to let that stop him. The idea of creating something from scratch, of providing for his girls in a way he had never known how to do, was something he couldn't resist. One Saturday morning, John woke up earlier than usual, the smell of pancakes filling the air. He was determined to make the day special. The girls had already started their Saturday routines, and he knew they would appreciate something different. He was trying, after all, to show them he was capable of doing more than just being their adoptive dad. He wanted to be their dad, the one who took care of them, who would fight for their happiness. He had done the grocery shopping the night before, his first real attempt at cooking, and now he was standing in the kitchen, attempting to flip pancakes with more enthusiasm than skill. He didn't mind the mess. The sound of sizzling batter and the laughter of the girls as they teased him about his technique made him feel something he hadn't felt that fun in a long time, a sense of purpose. By the time the pancakes were ready, the table was filled with smiling faces, and the house, which had once felt sterile and lifeless, now had a warmth to it that John couldn't ignore. The girls dug in eagerly, their chatter filling the air. For a brief moment, John was at peace. It was the first real family meal they had shared together, and it tasted better than anything he had ever eaten in his life. It wasn't the food that made it special. It was the way they all came together, sharing a bond he hadn't realized was possible. Later that week, John decided to take the girls to the community center. He had heard they were looking for volunteers, and it seemed like a good opportunity to do something meaningful together. As they painted murals and helped to clean up the playground, John noticed something in the girls that had been absent before. They were more relaxed, more willing to trust. They had started to see him not just as a caretaker, not just as the man who signed the adoption papers, but as a true father figure. He wasn't just providing for them materially, he was showing them that he cared, that he was willing to give them a real chance at a better life. The community center was filled with people, but to John, it felt like the smallest, most intimate space in the world. The sound of brushes on walls, the giggles of the younger girls as they played, and the sight of Angela and the others working side by side with him gave him a sense of belonging he had never known. At the end of the day, as they stood together, surveying the colorful mural they had painted, John felt a deep sense of pride. This was his family. They had come a long way in a short time. They had shared moments of joy and frustration, but they had always moved forward together. And in that moment, surrounded by the girls he had promised to protect, he knew that he had finally found the family he had spent his entire life searching for. As they drove back to the mansion that evening, the sky stretched above them, dark and wide, filled with the promise of a future they would create together. For the first time in his life, John felt as though he was no longer living for himself. He was living for them, and that was enough. The mansion, with its grandeur and cold beauty, no longer felt like an empty shell. It felt like home, and that in itself was a miracle. It was only the beginning. There would be struggles, there would be setbacks, but for the first time, John wasn't afraid. With his family by his side, he knew they could face whatever came next. They were no longer just 6 girls and a lonely man. They were a family, and that, he realized, was the greatest gift of all. The house had never been quieter, yet never felt more alive. John sat at the edge of the couch, the room dimly lit by the soft glow of a lamp in the corner. The sound of soft breathing filled the space around him. The girls, all 6 of them, were asleep, scattered across the living room. Angela had claimed the armchair, Maya curled up in a blanket on the floor, and the rest were sprawled on the couch, their faces peaceful in sleep. The television screen, long abandoned, flickered quietly, casting shadows on the walls. It had been a long day, full of simple joys that had once felt foreign to him. They had spent the afternoon volunteering, painting murals at the community center, and laughing together as they shared a pizza afterward. Afterward, they had all crowded into the living room, playing board games and watching movies until late into the night. John had watched as the girls slowly let down their guards, growing more comfortable, more at home with him. And for the first time in his life, he didn't feel like a stranger in his own space. His role as their father hadn't always been easy to accept. In the beginning, doubt had gnawed at him, his insecurities clouding the promise he had made. But now, looking at them all, he saw something he never thought possible. He was part of something real, something worth fighting for. John stood up quietly, taking one last look at the room. He had never known the meaning of family. He had never known the depth of connection that these 6 girls had slowly but surely brought into his life. And now, watching over them as they slept, so vulnerable, so trusting, he realized that this was it. This was the purpose he had been seeking all along. This was what he had been missing. His future was no longer about building more wealth, about gaining more success. It was about them. It was about showing them that they were enough, that they were loved, wanted, and that they would never be alone again. John walked over to the window, staring out into the dark night. The mansion, so grand and cold just a few months ago, now felt like a home, a sanctuary. But it wasn't just the house that had changed. It was him, too. He had spent so much time chasing empty goals, building walls around his heart. But now, he had torn those walls down, and in their place there was a bond, unbreakable, undeniable. He could never undo the years of isolation, the years of loneliness. But he didn't need to. The girls were his new beginning, his chance to create something lasting, something real. They had come into his life like a storm, sweeping away the ashes of his old existence and replacing them with something new, something that could grow. As he stood there, the weight of the day catching up with him, John finally understood what it meant to be truly alive. It wasn't about the accolades, the power, or the money. It was about moments like these, quiet, simple moments where you could look at the people around you and know without a doubt that you had found your place in the world. A soft sound broke through his thoughts, a small cough from Maya, who shifted in her sleep. John turned, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. He walked back over to the couch, kneeling beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. His heart swelled as he looked at her, the little girl who had been the most uncertain, the most afraid. And now, here she was. her tiny hand resting against his, as though it had always been meant to be this way. He stayed there for a while, simply watching over them, allowing himself to feel the peace that had settled into his heart. It was no longer a dream. It was real. John's life, once defined by ambition and success, now had a new purpose: to give these girls everything they had been denied, to be the father they needed and deserved. And in return, they had given him something he could never buy: a family. As the night deepened, John finally stood up, walking over to the door. He paused, glancing back at the girls one last time before closing the door gently behind him. His future was uncertain. There would be challenges ahead, moments of doubt and obstacles to overcome. But for the first time, he wasn't afraid. He had found the one thing that had always been missing: love. And with that love, he knew that no matter what happened, they would always be a family. The mansion, once an empty symbol of wealth and solitude, had become the place where his heart truly belonged. And no matter how many years passed, he would always remember this night, the night that marked the true beginning of his new life.